At a family dinner, I sat at the table with a broken arm. I couldn't even cut my own food, so I sat there watching everyone else eat. The guests avoided my eyes. My daughter quietly said my husband had to teach her some respect. My son-in-law bragged about it without shame. The old woman thought she still called the shots, but I showed them different. I just smiled. 10 minutes later, the doorbell rang. When my son-in-law answered it, he learned who truly held the power. If my story touches something deep in you, subscribe to the channel and stay with me for the next one. You're not alone in this. The scent of honey-glazed ham and sweet potatoes filled the air, rich and inviting, the kind of aroma that should have felt like home during a holiday gathering. The warm glow from the chandelier above us cast soft shadows on the walls, making the room feel almost cozy if you didn't know better. Candle flames flickered gently in the draft from the slightly open window, sending little dances of light across the silverware. To everyone else around that long oak table, it probably did feel like home, but for me, sitting in the chair that had been my husband's for decades, it only sharpened the emptiness in my stomach and the ache in my soul. My plate sat in front of me, fine porcelain with a simple blue pattern that my late husband and I picked out on a trip to Savannah back in the 80s. The edges were chipped just a little now from years of use, a reminder of better times, of laughter and shared meals that felt like a lifetime ago. It was untouched, not a single bite on it, gleaming under the light like it was mocking me. My right arm rested heavily on the red tablecloth, wrapped in a thick white cast that went from my knuckles almost to my elbow. The skin around the edges was bruised purple and yellow, swollen like it might burst at any moment, hot to the touch even through the fabric of my sleeve. Every small movement sent a wave of pain radiating up to my shoulder, a deep throb that made my breath catch, forcing me to sit perfectly still. It was a clean fracture of the ulna with some displacement. I knew that even before the emergency room doctor confirmed it. I'd felt the bone give way with that horrible crack when Derek slammed me against the kitchen counter. The sound had echoed in my head ever since, like a door slamming shut on the life I thought I had left. I could still feel the cold granite edge biting into my side, the way my body had twisted instinctively to protect itself, the shock of it stealing my breath for those first terrifying seconds. "Come on, everybody, dig in!" Derek's voice boomed across the table, full of that false cheer he used when he wanted to show off, cutting through the low murmur of conversation like a knife. "This ham is perfect. Elena outdid herself tonight." He sat at the head of the table, in my husband's old spot, his broad frame spilling over the arms of the chair, the wood creaking slightly under his weight. His tie was loosened, shirt sleeves rolled up, face flushed from the wine he'd been pouring generously for himself and his guests, the glass leaving faint red rings on the tablecloth. He carved huge slices of ham with aggressive strokes, juice dripping onto the platter as he piled his plate high. Grease glistened on his fingers, and he licked them without a second thought, smacking his lips loudly, the sound grating in the quiet room. Around us were his co-workers from the construction firm, 3 men and 1 woman, all mid-level managers who depended on him for promotions and contracts. They ate politely but quietly, forks scraping plates, eyes darting anywhere but at me, the clink of silverware the only sound breaking the tension. One of them coughed awkwardly, clearing his throat, as if the air itself was too thick to swallow. They could feel the poison in the air, thick and heavy, like the humidity before a summer storm rolling in. They saw the 68-year-old woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back neatly, sitting straight despite the pain, with an empty plate and a cast on her arm. But none of them said a word. Derek was the one who signed their paychecks, the one who could make or break their careers with a phone call. I wondered if any of them felt a twinge of guilt, or if fear just won out every time, the way it had slowly won out in my own home over the years. I flexed the fingers on my left hand, testing them, feeling the slight tremble from fatigue and the chill of the room settling into my joints.
They worked fine, but reaching across the table for the ham platter or the bowl of sweet potatoes was impossible with my dominant arm immobilized. The steam rising from the dishes made my mouth water painfully, a cruel tease that twisted my empty stomach even tighter. Asking for help would have meant admitting defeat in front of him, lowering myself in a way I wasn't ready to do, not yet. A small part of me feared that if I asked, he'd only twist it further, make a show of it for his audience. Derek, one of the younger guys, cleared his throat softly, his voice hesitant in the heavy air. "Mr. Lang, maybe we should pass some food to Mrs. Margaret." He shifted in his seat, glancing quickly at me, before dropping his eyes again, his fork hovering uncertainly over his plate. "Mind your business, Kyle." Derek shot back without even looking up, refilling his glass with more red wine, the liquid glugging loudly from the bottle as it splashed high. The bottle was a pricey one, a Cabernet from Napa that I'd bought years ago for a special occasion, one we'd never gotten around to celebrating because life had slowly eroded those moments. "Margaret's watching her figure these days. Isn't that right, Mom?" He finally glanced at me, his eyes gleaming with that cruel satisfaction he couldn't quite hide, holding my gaze just long enough to twist the knife, a small smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. No remorse there, just victory, the kind a bully feels when he's finally got the upper hand on someone who's stood tall too long. I felt a flicker of something hot in my chest, anger maybe, or just the raw edge of betrayal, but I pushed it down, keeping my face neutral, my breathing steady even as my heart raced beneath the surface. "She asked for it," Elena added softly from her seat beside him, her voice barely above a whisper, cracking just a little at the end. My daughter wore a simple green sweater that brought out her eyes, but it couldn't hide how worn she looked, how the spark I'd known in her as a girl had dimmed, replaced by tired lines around her mouth and shadows under her eyes. She picked at her food, avoiding my gaze entirely, her fork pushing pieces around without really eating, her free hand twisting the napkin in her lap. "She's not as steady on her feet anymore," Derek went on, talking to his guests like he was sharing a harmless anecdote over coffee, waving his knife for emphasis, a drop of glaze flicking onto the tablecloth. "Balance isn't what it used to be at her age. Yesterday, she was rummaging around in the garage for some old junk. I told her to leave it alone, but no, she had to keep going." His voice carried that smug edge, like he was proud of the story, relishing the control. And boom, down she went. "Could have been worse, honestly," he chuckled, a deep grating sound that made my skin crawl, and the guests offered weak, uncomfortable laughs in response, shifting awkwardly in their chairs, one woman forcing a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. I stared at my daughter, searching her face for any sign of the girl who used to run to me for comfort, who would curl up beside me on the couch with a book. For 35 years, I'd been a high school principal, shaping young minds, handling crises with calm authority. I'd seen fear in teenagers' eyes, knew how resentment built, how respect eroded, but I couldn't pinpoint the exact day I lost Elena. The day she became this quiet accomplice to the man who treated me like an inconvenience. Deep down, a small voice wondered if I'd missed the signs, if I'd been too busy with work to see it coming, or if I'd let my own pride blind me to the slow poison seeping in. But now wasn't the time for that regret. It would come later, in the quiet nights ahead. "It was just a mishap," Elena murmured at last, meeting my eyes for a fleeting second before looking away again, her cheeks flushing faintly. There was fear there, but not for my pain, for what might come if she spoke up, for the storm it would bring down on her comfortable life. But Derek felt she needed a reminder about who's in charge now.
"You're retired, Mom. You don't run things anymore." Her words hung there, soft but cutting, and I felt my throat tighten, a lump rising that I swallowed back hard. My gut knotted with hunger pangs, sharp and insistent, twisting like a fist inside me, making me shift slightly in my seat and regret it immediately as pain flared. I hadn't eaten properly since the incident, not since Derek, furious about the house title, had shoved me so hard my arm took the brunt against the counter edge. The pain throbbed in rhythm with the old wall clock in the living room, the one my parents had given us as a wedding gift. Tick, tick, tick. Each sound felt like a heartbeat counting down my endurance, reminding me how long I'd been holding on. That clock had marked birthdays, anniversaries, quiet evenings by the fire with my husband's arm around me. Now it counted down something else, something I could feel building in the quiet spaces between their words, a tension that made the air feel heavier, warmer despite the cool evening breeze slipping through the cracked window. Derek lifted his glass high, the wine catching the light, swirling it lazily. To family order, a home needs structure. The one who handles the finances sets the rules, and anyone living off kindness keeps quiet and knows their place. He drank deeply, then speared a sweet potato with his fork like it had offended him, chewing noisily, bits of food visible as he spoke with his mouth half full. Deep inside, something shifted in me, from burning anger to a cold, steady resolve. It was the same feeling I'd get before addressing a rowdy assembly at school, when emotions had to be set aside for clarity, when I knew I had to stand firm no matter the chaos around me. No tears now. Tears invite pity, and pity was a weapon he would use against me. I glanced at the clock on the wall. The hands crept towards 8, the room growing dimmer as the evening light faded outside the windows, the sky turning a deep indigo beyond the glass. The room fell quieter, only the sounds of chewing and occasional small talk from the guests, forced and strained, trailing off into awkward pauses. Derek thought he'd won. He thought the cast was proof of my fragility, my surrender. I sat up straighter, ignoring the stab in my arm, feeling the fabric of my blouse pull tight across my shoulders, the slight dampness of sweat at the small of my back from the strain of holding still. Derek. My voice cut through the murmurs, calm and clear, surprising even me with its steadiness, though my heart pounded so hard I wondered if they could hear it. He paused mid-bite, fork hovering, a piece of ham dangling. The guests stilled completely. Even Elena looked up, her eyes widening slightly, fork frozen halfway to her mouth. "What do you want, old lady?" he muttered, his tone dripping with irritation, lowering his fork slowly as if it weighed too much. "You're in my husband's chair, and by my count you have less than a minute left to sit there comfortably." The words came out even, but inside my heart pounded, a rush of fear and defiance mixing in my veins. He turned fully now, face reddening deeper, a smirk twisting his lips, but his eyes narrowed just a fraction. "You hear that, folks? She's giving me a timer. You gonna wave that cast at me or something?" He laughed loudly, slapping the table hard enough to make the glasses rattle and a spoon clatter to the floor. "Go on, count it down. I'm terrified." His mockery echoed, bouncing off the walls, but I saw the flicker of unease in his eyes, quickly buried under bravado, his hand tightening around his glass. I didn't respond. I just watched the clock's second hand sweep forward, steady and unrelenting, the soft tick growing louder in my ears. I knew a secret he didn't. This quiet wasn't weakness. It was anticipation, a breath held before the storm, the calm I'd learned to summon when everything else was falling apart. The hand hit 12, and right then the doorbell rang, long, insistent, authoritative. The crystal glasses vibrated slightly, a faint hum in the sudden hush that fell like a blanket. Derek frowned, his laugh dying abruptly, but recovered quickly with a grin, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of glaze. "Ah, perfect timing. That's probably the real estate agent I called. We're handling some family paperwork tonight, quick and easy. Then we get back to eating." Elena sighed in relief, her shoulders dropping visibly, her hand pressing to her chest for a moment. "Mom, just cooperate this once, please." Her plea was soft, almost desperate, her eyes pleading now, but it stung all the same, like salt in an open wound. I gripped the table edge with my left hand, adrenaline pushing back the pain, making my palms sweat against the wood, my knuckles whitening.
Derek stood, adjusting his shirt with a tug, and strode to the door with that swagger he loved, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood, echoing down the hall. I heard the deadbolt turn, the door open with a creak. "Evening, come on in, we've been waiting." His voice trailed off abruptly, like someone had yanked the words from his throat, replaced by a choked gasp. Silence stretched from the hallway, thick and unnerving, the kind that makes your skin prickle. Then heavy footsteps, measured and deliberate, not the shuffle of an agent in dress shoes. These were boots, confident, echoing with purpose, each one landing like a verdict. Derek's voice came back, high and strained, cracking at the edges, barely recognizable. "Chief Harlan? Sir, I didn't know you were coming personally." The table froze, the guests exchanged wide-eyed looks, forks paused halfway to mouths, one man slowly setting his glass down with a soft clink. The name meant something big, the police chief of our city, a man whose face was on the news regularly, who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. What was he doing at our door? My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression calm, folding my good hand in my lap to hide the slight tremble. 2 uniformed officers appeared in the doorway first, tall and impassive, scanning the room with practiced eyes that lingered on each face. Then Derek backed in, hands raised slightly, face drained of color, sweat beading on his forehead and trickling down his temple. Behind him stepped Chief Marcus Harlan himself, a tall black man in his late 50s, uniform crisp, silver hair cropped short, eyes sharp as they took in the scene, missing nothing, not even the empty plate in front of me. He carried a small potted poinsettia, bright red against his dark jacket, the kind people give at Christmas, its leaves vibrant and fresh, a stark contrast to the tension thickening the air. Derek stammered, his voice shaking now, higher than I'd ever heard it. "Chief, this is unexpected, if I'd known." The chief walked past him without acknowledgement, as if Derek were furniture, his presence filling the room like a sudden drop in temperature, making the candles flicker harder. His gaze locked on me immediately, softening just a fraction, a flicker of recognition and concern passing through those sharp eyes. He approached the head of the table, looked at the spread of food, the steam still rising faintly from the cooling dishes, and finally at my empty plate, and finally at my casted arm. His expression hardened, jaw tightening, a muscle twitching there as he took in the bruises peeking from the cast. The room held its breath, the clock ticked louder in the silence, each second stretching, pulling the tension taut. Chief Harlan knelt beside my chair, placing the poinsettia gently on the table, its light pine scent cutting through the heavy air of ham and wine. He took my left hand in both of his, careful and warm, his calloused palms steady against my cooler skin. "Margaret." His voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of old debts, of a promise kept after all these years. "You told me it was a fall, but you didn't say they were letting you go hungry."
He stood slowly, turning to the table, his movements deliberate, the floorboards creaking softly under his weight. Without a word, he placed a hand on the back of Derek's occupied chair. Derek jumped up like he'd been burned, retreating a step, his chair scraping harshly across the floor. The chief sat, claiming the space effortlessly, naturally, as if it had always been meant for someone with real authority. An officer placed a clean plate and utensils in front of him, gleaming and untouched, pulled silently from a kit. He carved a portion of ham with precise cuts, the knife gliding smoothly through the meat, then smaller pieces, neat and careful, almost tender. He held a forkful to my lips. "Eat." There was no pity in it, only dignity, a quiet command wrapped in respect that made my eyes sting for the first time that night. I took the bite, flavor bursting after so long without food, the salty sweetness flooding my senses, warmth spreading through my chest like sunlight after rain. Strength returned bit by bit as he fed me patiently, his eyes meeting mine with unspoken understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the strength I'd hidden for too long.
Only when the edge was off my hunger, when I felt the fog lifting from my mind and the tremble leaving my good hand, did he speak again. Who caused the injury? His tone was even, but it carried authority that silenced the room completely, even the clock seeming quieter. Derek forced a laugh, brittle and false, echoing hollowly. "Chief, it's nothing, family stuff. She slipped in the garage. Old age, you know, clumsy." He tried to sound casual, but his hands fidgeted at his sides, betraying him. Elena nodded quickly, too quickly, her head bobbing like she couldn't stop. "We were worried sick." Her voice wavered, breaking on the last word. The chief's eyes never left Derek, steady and unblinking. "No barrage steps in this house. It's a single-story ranch." Derek paled further, swallowing hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I meant, figuratively, stress. Caring for her is hard." His excuse came out weak, trailing off. I spoke then, my voice stronger now with food in me, steady despite the storm inside. "There was no accident. He shoved me when I refused to sign over the house." The words felt like releasing a long-held breath, a weight lifting even as my arm ached. The chief nodded to me, a small acknowledgement, respect in that simple gesture. "Show them the proof." I directed Elena to my sideboard on the fringe, my voice calm. She brought it with trembling hands, her fingers funneling the clasp twice before it opened. Inside was the X-ray from the hospital, dated yesterday, showing the defensive fracture clear as day, the jagged line unmistakable against the shadows. The chief held it to the light from the chandelier, the shadows playing across his face, deepening the lines there. "This isn't a fall. This is blocking a blow." His voice was quiet, but it landed heavy, final. He ordered an immediate investigation into Derek's business dealings, suspected embezzlement from city contracts. Evidence was already mounting, he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt, no escape. Derek exploded then, his face twisting in panic and rage. "This is my house. I pay for everything. She's nothing but a burden." He lunged toward me in rage, his chair toppling with a crash that made the guests flinch. But the chief stood, a wall of authority, broad and unyielding, and Derek crumbled, stopping short, breath coming in gasps, hands clenching and unclenching. Officers cuffed him as he begged and blamed Elena, his voice rising to a whine, cracking with desperation. She tried to claim victim status, tears starting down her cheeks, but I reminded her of her words that night, telling me to be quiet so neighbors wouldn't hear, her face close to mine, eyes cold and distant. The house wasn't theirs anyway. Years ago, I'd quietly transferred it to a trust for the local school district in my husband's memory, with lifetime rights for me, a decision I'd made in silence to protect what was ours, foreseeing a day like this, even if I hadn't wanted to believe it. Derek had assaulted me for nothing. They were removed, him arrested, his protests echoing down the hall and fading into the night, her barred from returning, walking out with slumped shoulders, clutching her bag like it was all she had left. The chief stayed, ensuring I ate more, his presence a quiet shield, arranging medical care with a few calm words into his radio, his hand briefly on my shoulder, a steadying touch. Later, alone at the clean table, with tea steaming gently between us, the windows open to let in the cool night air, carrying the faint scent of pine from outside, I picked up a fork with my left hand and fed myself dessert. The sweetness lingered on my tongue, a small victory that tasted like freedom. My fingers shook at first, but steadied with each bite, the tremble fading as resolve grew. The clock ticked on, marking a new beginning, steady and sure. If you've ever felt that betrayal, comment below and share your story. And if my words meant something to you, subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this waiting. Stay strong. You're not alone.